To effectively address the impending challenges of access, retention, and completion of basic education in Gombe State, Invictus Africa, a non-governmental organization, has developed a gender-responsive education budgeting practical guide. Belgum Samari reports that the document was launched during a media party and training on gender response in education budgeting.
Low capacity of education administrators in monitoring and implementation, inadequate training, low interest in girl-child education, among other issues, are some of the challenges identified after conducting an assessment on factors contributing to out-of-school children. The Gender-Based Responsive Education Budgetary Guide developed by Invictus Africa, a non-governmental organization, is expected to help government officials to incorporate the education needs of boys and girls in addressing the identified challenges in Gombe State.
So for the Gender Responsive Education Budgeting project, we had the opportunity to work with 2 states, and we decided to pick Oyo and Gombe, but I'll focus on Gombe because that's where we are right now. Gombe, because Gombe has shown indication that they are really interested in advancing equal access to education.
So with this guide, it will also incorporate a lot of things that were hitherto maybe missing or were hitherto so silent that we have also not observed it. But there's going to be a change.
If properly implemented, certainly it will go a long way in solving most of the problems there.
Participants appreciate the training, which they say is timely, as it will go a long way toward addressing the out-of-school and other issues affecting access, retention, and completion of basic education.
Knowledge is coming timely, and then we are going to ensure that whatever it is we need to do, particularly as civil society, we prioritize girls' issues. We advocate for them to find their ways into the 2025 budget more than the previous year's budget.
For the Ministry of Health, which we are been working with the Ministry of Education, it's very critical for us to always be gender responsive in our budgeting to ensure that we carry along some of the activities that will improve education for girl child especially, and then to recognize gender as a very important one.
The Gender Responsive Education Budgetary Guide contains detailed information regarding key budgetary concepts, principles, and practical steps to develop and implement an education budget that works for all. Belgum Samari, NTA News.
Now with me in the studio to shed more light on the gender-responsive education budgeting in Nigeria is Buki Shonibare, Executive Director in Invictus Africa. Mayo, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you briefly tell us the mission of Invictus Africa in Nigeria?
Invictus Africa is a civic tech organization where we use data to identify inequality gaps, such inequality gaps that impact on historically marginalized populations, women, girls, persons with disabilities, young people, people from ethnic minority groups, So basically we promote human rights and gender equality using data-driven advocacy. We engage relevant stakeholders, and then we leverage digital technology to make sure that data, translates to improved society.
Okay. What informed your decision to come up with the practical guide on gender response education budgeting in Nigeria and the choice of Oyo and Gombe State?
Thank you. So Malala Fund, which supports this project, works in some states in Nigeria. Oyo is part of the state, Gombe is part of the state. So when we were starting this project, we thought to look at, the states that have shown progressiveness, that have shown interest in relation to education of our school children generally. And we saw that definitely Oyo and Gombe. I met the governor, Governor Muhammad Unoha Yaya, sometime last year during the UN General Assembly, just to tell him that we're having this project that we want to come, and he showed a lot of interest. And he immediately linked me up with somebody that we can work with. And we had meetings with him. where we shared this. And so for us, Gombe has shown that that indication that they are interested in equal access to education. If you look at the budgetary allocation, which is a key indicator that helps us know when a state is prioritizing a particular social issue. You look at in 2021, for instance, there was a 13.89% budgetary allocation to education. When we came down to 2022, we saw that it came down to about 11.23. But in 2023, we have a 12.04% allocation to education. Currently, in the 2024 budget, there is a 12.6%, let's say 13%. Now, UNESCO standard says that we should have between 15 to 20% of public expenditure allocated to education. So when you have a state having like 13%, that's a good indication that the state is prioritizing education. So it means that whatever project we are bringing to support what the state government is doing is going to advance. And lastly, I would say in the Gombe State Development Plan of 2021 to 2030, we see that part of the priorities of the government is to make sure that every person in Gombe State is literate. And so that tells you that the government is prioritizing this. And this is just our own way of supporting the effort of the government.
Okay. How will the guide help in addressing the challenges of out-of-school children in Gombe State?
Good question. So the guide does three key things, and that's how it will help. First is the fact that the guide helps us to look at the allocation to education in the state and look at where the gaps are in relation to gender responsiveness. One of the things that we discussed during the media parley and the training is that the responsibility to make sure that all of the children in Gombe State goes to school is not just the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. So we cannot just look at the Ministry of Education budget and say this is how much the state is allocating to education. We have to look at Ministry of Health and the gender responsiveness in relation to education that they allocate to. So for instance, providing water, sanitation and hygiene facilities in the school, you look at Ministry of Water Resources and Ministry of Health. Providing sanitary pads, for instance, in school, you look at Ministry of Health. You look at Ministry of Sports, to make sure that they advance, sport within the school, especially those sports that are dominated by men. You look at how our female athletes have performed, even in the Olympics. It starts oftentimes from education. And so you also look at, how other ministries that relate to education, not just the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Women Affairs, making sure that issues around gender-based violence is addressed. There is a counseling unit that teachers are trained in relation to this. How about even the disability issue? It was good that the Commissioner of Education told me today that there has been public hearing on the disability inclusion bill, the social inclusion bill. These are two critical bills that will help to bridge the gap. So how will this guide help? This guide will help us first identify the peculiar issues that impact on boys and girls, that impact on their access, retention, and completion of schools. And once we identify those things, the guide is then saying that make sure that in the budget of all of these sectors that they are attending to all these issues that have been identified. But beyond allocation, we must also make sure that spending is also done in that regard. And finally, when we do the budget cycle, the preparation of the budget, the stakeholder consultation, the approval, the monitoring of the budget, that we see that the budget is being spent towards attending to or addressing the peculiar and intersecting needs of boys and girls. The goal is to make sure that every boy and every girl in Gombe State has access to, is retained in, and can complete basic education, primary to senior secondary.
Okay, in just less than a second, if possible, because we're running out of time,
Yes.
What do you expect from the line ministries in achieving the set goals of the documents?
Simple. We want all of the 9 ministries which I've mentioned earlier to make sure that their budget going forward identifies the peculiar gender needs of boys and girls and provides for it. But most importantly, that we should have specific budget lines that addresses these issues so that 2025 and upward, we can make sure that our budget is structured in such a way that is sensitive and is responsive to the peculiar educational needs of boys and girls in Gombe State.
Okay. I want to thank you so much, Ma, for your insight and thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.